Hello and welcome aboard the Chatbus, the podcast miniseries that talks with fellow travellers through the forest of films of one of the world's greatest animation studios, Studio Ghibli. I'm Michael Leader.
And I'm Jake Cunningham, and I've got my bus pass.
So join us on our quest into the glorious world of Ghibli. Jake, you're here for a second round on the Chatbus.
Oh yeah, you know me. I might get travel sick on regular buses, but the chat bus, I'll always sit on the front. Although I've recently got told that actually, if you do suffer from travel sickness, sitting next to the wheel, so if you look at the wheelbase and sit closest to where the wheels are, there's less wiggle, and so sit next to the wheel if you get sick, which is not the point of advice that I expected this podcast to kick off with. But there you go. You learn something new from all of these episodes, don't you?
Absolutely. Gosh, we're dealing out some real home truths here, some tips for life. Who are we talking to this week, Jake?
So, in this episode, we've got Kenneth Ladekjær and Jess Nicholls from the Sun Creature Studio, who have just recently made history, have they not?
They absolutely have. So they are the studio behind the animated documentary Flea, which was nominated for 3 Oscars this year, making history, as you said, Jake. Nominations in 3 categories, including Best Animated Feature, Best Documentary, and Best Foreign Language Film.
Yes, such a good film, and it's one of those really nice ones where it's had a really kind of long cinematic life already, and people have just been picking it up, and it's getting bigger and bigger, a bit like Drive My Car as well. So this film premiered at Sundance 2021, and then you've had Nikolai Coster-Waldau, aka Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones, and Riz Ahmed come on as executive producers. They've lent their voices to a dub, and all of this hype has gradually kind of built across the year, and then come to now. And this is a really nice surprise that a grown-up piece of animation really has become a bit of a breakout hit and has found audiences who maybe wouldn't normally be watching documentary or wouldn't normally be watching animation.
Yeah, it's always a treat for us when people who don't normally watch animation are watching animated films. If you haven't had a chance to see Flea yet, comes strongly recommended from us at Ghibliotech. Just let's have a quick synopsis before we dive in, because this is something a bit different from the usual for us. Flea tells the story of Amin Nawabi as he grapples with a painful secret he has kept hidden for 20 years. One that threatens to derail the life he has built for himself and his soon-to-be husband. Recounted mostly through animation to director Jonas Poher Rasmussen, he tells for the first time the story of his extraordinary journey as a child refugee from Afghanistan. So this collision of animation, documentary, really one of a kind, I think, Jake.
Yes, and that's exactly why we wanted to talk to the guest that we've got today, because of how varied the style of this film is. So within those different realms of memory that it exists in. So in Amin's present day, in his childhood, and then he's in these kind of fragmented traumatic memories that are a bit looser. You've got a lot of different approaches to animation. And so we've got the animation director, Kenneth, and the art director, Jess, to explore more about the visual identity of Flea and the character of Amin.
Absolutely. They were very patient answering our nerdy, naive questions, because I guess week in, week out in this podcast we talk about backgrounds, talk about animation. We've quoted filmmakers where they talk about how the individual animators can almost be actors when creating their characters through a scene. Also, we've mentioned Ghibli backgrounds, Ghibli clouds, Ghibli skies in the past. So it's amazing to talk to people whose actual job is doing that, and thank you to them for being so patient. So there is a lot of Ghibli, actually, more than you think, maybe, in this conversation.
Yes, well, and there's a lot of Ghibli happening at Sun Creature, because if you go on YouTube and look for a lovely advert for Visit Oregon, the American state, then it is maybe the biggest Ghibli love letter since Mary and the Witch's Flower. It just is just a lovely, lovely Miyazaki recreation, but imagine all of everything that you love about Ghibli and Japan and the look of a Miyazaki film, but transport it not from Japan or not from Wales, but all the way to Portland, Oregon, and imagine what that might look like. And it is very, very lovely. And so we do get into a bit of how you go about recreating the look of a Miyazaki film too.
Mm-hmm. So let's listen to our conversation with Kenneth and Jess. Kenneth, Jess, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure. Congratulations on Flea. We'll be talking about that shortly, but we love to set off all these conversations with Studio Ghibli, which of course is in the title of our podcast. And we like to ask our guests, what was your first experience with Ghibli? Who wants to take that question first out of the two of you?
I don't really remember the first time I watched it. I think it was like growing up in, like, I'm Australian originally, but I spent a lot of my teen years in the UK. I remember my friend had her dad was part of an animation school in High Wycombe at some point, so I think he introduced us when I was pretty young. But I think I really remember getting into it when I was about, I think I must have been late teens, early 20s, and I was studying in Edinburgh, and I had a really bad breakup. So I think I downloaded the entire filmography and just went through. And I think I remember watching Pompoko and being like, this is amazing. And I don't know what it says about me that my breakup film is a film about raccoon testicles, but it's fine. Yeah, and then it stuck.
Yeah, you just needed those testicles, and then it all clicked into place.
Exactly.
It's an ocean of transforming testicles, and then over.
I'm done. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, but I promptly dropped out of uni and went to study animation instead. So.
Inspired by Pompoko, etc., or?
I think so. I think it was a mix of that and some I also watched Waltz with Bashir around the same time, and a couple of other more not A-list films, I guess. And then that started a downhill slope.
And Kenneth, how about you? What was your first taste of Ghibli?
I remember that I think I came across it just by accident on the Danish TV, where they were showing Totoro, My Neighbor Totoro. But I think back then because it's for kids, then they divided it up into parts, which is blasphemy. But they had done that, so I probably watched the part 2 or 3 or something like that. They were just showing it random times. But as a kid, I just remember being like, "Whoa, what is this?" Even though I could not follow the story at all because you jump into the middle of it.
I suppose there's not really much of a story there anyway. So if there was one of theirs that you were going to turn into chapters, that's probably the one that's going to work.
Yeah, it's probably not the worst. But I still remember being caught by the mood of it, and that it felt special. There was something different about it compared to all the other more Disney style things I've seen back then. There was just that focus on the mood and those little moments where you just follow a character looking at stuff, and you're like, "What's going on?" So that was my sort of first encounter with the Miyazaki-san. But I think the proper full film watching is a little blasphemous as well. But I watched what's it called, the Princess Mononoke on YouTube. On that little on my shitty computer in my room as a kid. But even to the testament of that film, even on that little what do you call it, square on my screen, I was still just blown away by it. And then years later at animation school, I saw it in cinema, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's how you're supposed to watch it." It's pretty crazy.
Wow, we're already off to such a blasphemous start, as you said.
I feel totally vindicated for all the people that send mean tweets saying, "I can't believe he watched Spirited Away on a train," which I did do, but at least it was full screen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Then I'm setting the lowest standards, it seems.
Was it common for anime like that to be on telly then at that time?
not in Denmark. It was pretty rare. I think we had Pokemon and we had Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
And they were just like screening those episodes like in random. I remember. So you would just like suddenly be in Dragon Ball where he's fighting with Frieza, and then you would jump back to him as being a kid, like the day after that. It seems like they had no like, they didn't really care about the storyline. And then I had like, then there was a few times where they would pick up Totoro, or I even remember there's an anime called Blue Submarine or something like that, that they would also divide into parts for some reason, and then put up there.
And when you get into actually making animation, is there a bit of a Wizard of Oz moment where the curtain's drawn back and you can see what's making that magic? Because I think when we talk to people a lot about Ghibli, it's like, oh, I watched it when I was young and it was just so different and it wasn't what Disney was making, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Once you've gone into the careers that you've got into, are you able to discern more what that magic is?
That's a good question. Maybe you could start this time, Kenneth.
Alright. I feel like I'm always like just throwing at you, just like you start.
Yeah, I see it in your eyes.
Yeah, the doubt and insecurity. I think, I mean, technique-wise, you of course learn how to animate and you learn how to draw it, and you know how like a background is made and stuff. But I actually think, and this is probably perfect for a Ghibli podcast, but I actually think the Ghibli films still keep that kind of magic for me when I watch it. Because it's so much about like the good old craft in a way, and how things are drawn, so that you still like beautiful paintings where you can still get that wow effect as an artist. Because at least I don't see it like the cheats, or like they use that Photoshop brush for this and that, or they use this and this for, or they just copied a lot of drawings around to make it fake and movement or something. So the craft can still wow me, and then it's also just so much about, again, the mood and the story is what dictates how they're doing it. And then Miyazaki just has this sort of special sense of story and character that I think you just, I at least forget the craft after like a few minutes. Then I'm just into it, into the mood of it, and then it still has that sort of magical, nostalgic stemning, that's Danish mood.
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it. I think it's like there's so much about Ghibli that's or Ghibli, or however, I don't know which one is the correct one, but I think it's more about like the filmmaking aspect of it. I think you see the craft, and I guess it's like finding out like, oh, that's how much I don't know. So it's like, yeah, seeing a master at work, I guess, like in the same way that anyone could pick up a camera and you still go and see like a Coen Brothers film, and you're still like, how does that happen? Yeah. So you can see technically, like it's easy to kind of see how it's been done, but you still could never do it the same way.
I'm really intrigued by this binging the entire library, Jess. So what was it that, because I can't really binge stuff, telly and all that stuff. I don't have the stamina for it. But what pulled you through all that? What was it that was attracting you to keep going and watch all of them at once?
I mean, heartbreak was a lot of it.
it's quite a motivating force.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was also like, because I think it was, from what I remember, it was even in like year order when I got it. So I can't remember. I think at some point I was like, oh, I've seen Spirited Away a bunch of times, so I'll just start from the beginning and hope that they're all at that same caliber and just see how it goes. And I think it was just that like it's so different as well. Like I think if you go back and watch a lot of the big studios in the States, like Filmography, then you can see like this kind of creative direction that's really particular. And I think the Ghibli stuff really felt like it's a director's vision, I guess, every time. So I think in that way it was like, oh, this isn't so much about making money. This is about like someone's vision for what they want people to experience from a piece of art, I guess. So I think then you kind of just like, oh, well, thank God I have so many left. I'll just keep going.
And that's sort of been the journey of the podcast. When we started, Jake had really he'd seen Spirited Away on the train, as he said, but he was quite a novice and slowly revealing all these films to him. We didn't go chronologically, we sort of curated the journey. But what was great with Jake was seeing how, as he went through the library, he found his own favourites that maybe weren't the fan favourites. He was attracted to certain styles and filmmakers that maybe not what you'd expect. He became, one of your favorites was Isao Takahata, and so Jess, did you get a sense of that when you were going through the library? You've already mentioned Pompoko, which is quite a deep cut immediately to mention, but what did you make of the other ones? Any other favourites?
Yeah, I think I remember there was an animation teacher who asked us in our first year at school, like, what is everyone's favourite animation film? And I remember saying Pompoko, and there were so many people in the class being like, oh, nerd. Yeah. So I think... yeah, I'm sure some, like, it was like, okay, guys, this is animation school, come on, like, up your game. It's not that, like, weird a selection, but yeah, no, I think, I really like the Takahata stuff as well. Like, I think My Neighbor the Yamadas is also really good, and, yeah, I guess I'm not as big a fan of, like, Kaguya, and I think there's something about that, like, the further in you get, the bigger the budgets get, and the less, like, restraint you have, so you become maybe, like, you're able to do maybe too much. Is maybe how I feel about it. So yeah, I think a lot of those earlier ones, also for like Miyazaki, I really like Nausicaa still, and some of the earlier stuff more than the newer ones, I think.
I love there's so many common threads in these conversations, which I love, that come up so often, of Nausicaa being the best, so in theory that Miyazaki only ever got worse as a filmmaker, and that all the animators pick My Neighbors the Yamadas. Like, particularly with people interested in animation, that film seems to go down so well. What is it about it?
It's a great character study. I don't know, have you seen it, Kenneth, that one?
Yes, it is also my favorite from him. From Isao. Yeah, because it just has, like, it's such good character study, as you say, and the animation is just so good, and it's so, like, full of personality and these little, like, story segments. I think you're right. I totally agree with you, Jess, on the fact that I don't think he gets better with the higher the budget he has, like, because it's sort of, you get a little bit more distance from the actual story and the characters, and I think that the Neighbors Yamada, you're just, like, you're in there. There's, like, it's so bare bones of what, like, the style is, that you just have to focus on what the necessities are in terms of character, and what is, like, the little stories and the little character interactions and all that stuff. And as an animator, that's just like, you just eat that up.
I was going to say, I think a lot of Takahata's ones are like that. Like, they all kind of feel like character studies in a way.
Oh yeah, they're just dreamy. I think that's what's so exciting to me about his form, is, like, the confidence just to strip stuff away as well. Like, Miyazaki is great as a great world builder, and those frames are so full of life and detail. And so I think that's what made me so excited about watching the Takahata films, is, like, in Only Yesterday, when the backgrounds just disappear and she flies up into the air, like, those moments where it's just so focused on the emotion and the story and that connection rather than the look of the thing. He's so good at. Oh yeah. But that, yeah. So let's take the opportunity, because Michael and I are not animators. It'd be great to look at these films from a craft point of view. So, like, thinking of, well, I suppose how these things actually get made. Jess, you've been lucky enough to go to the museum, like we have as well, where they do kind of give you a little bit look into the pipeline of these films. Is it scarily intimidating to look at that kind of stuff and see how a Ghibli film gets made?
I think the backgrounds, yeah. I mean, I'm like, Kenneth's definitely the animation side of this, like, the partnership that we had on Flea. I'm more of, like, a background person, camera person. So I think there's that one room in the museum which has, like, all the original paintings just casually, like, pinned to the wall. It's not even behind any, like, perspex, you could shoot this and it's not gonna... Yeah, they're just hanging out. It's insane. So I think there's something about that just makes me want to, like, just, like, put some, I don't know, some, like, aluminium foil or anything on it to, like, just protect it from these, like, heathen school children that are just running around. But I think, I mean, the museum's also, like, a very idealized way of looking at it, I guess. Like, all the stages of productions are so presented as, like, these little rooms in a house and things, so it looks really cozy, and I'm sure that it wasn't cozy all the time.
But Jess, I'd love to get your sense of what is so special about Ghibli's backgrounds and art direction, because we talk about Kazuo Oga, who's like one of he's the main art director on films like and background artist on films like Totoro, and it's something we tend to focus on character design and animation, but the backgrounds are so important to that. And having an actual art director on the show, what is so special for you about Ghibli and that aspect of the craft?
I mean, you guys talked a little bit about like the whole stripping away unnecessary details and things, and I think it takes like there's a lot of egos, I guess, in like animation and art in general, and I think that it takes a certain special type of person to kind of be as amazing a painter as Kazuo Oga is, and then just like not paint everything. Like you're still making room for the characters. Like still the main focus is how to tell the story and what's important to the mood and the tone and all that. So I think it's the fact that it's that great filmmaking skill combined with that he's like had the time to both be an amazing painter but also know the like story enough to know when to stop. And I mean, I have his book, and it's only in Japanese, and I have tried to read it so many times, and every time it's like a single little tear because I just can't. But yeah, it's very impressive, just on like a technical level as well, I think.
Yeah, it makes Jake and I were talking about this earlier. It makes me think of we were talking with the curators of the Miyazaki exhibition in the Academy Museum in Los Angeles, and they had like a blue sky, Ghibli blue sky, painted on the walls, and they had to get the guy who does the blue skies and clouds to come and advise about that. It's how important those landscapes and those backgrounds are to the Ghibli look and vibe and feel.
Yeah, I mean it's like a whole package, really, right? The whole like there's not really any side of the filmmaking that lets it down. So you can talk about the animation, but then you've also got to mention all the other stuff alongside. It's just the masterwork.
Yeah. Well, so on top of those backgrounds, we've got our characters. So Kenneth, we'll turn to you there. So thinking of the character movement that we might see in a Ghibli film, like looking at, I suppose, the stuff that we love about them, the way that they are so relaxing because they show us like the minute details of life as much as the big adventures. What's it about the movement here that we're seeing that kind of makes them unique?
I think it's a bit the same as what Jess says about the backgrounds and stuff. It's really like less is more. That it really focuses on what is needed instead of just being like spectacular or to sort of like show a funny movement or make something look impressive. It always feels like it has some sort of root in the character in the moment. I really like, for example, when you the first time, who was the protagonist in Princess Mononoke. Yeah, Ashitaka. Yeah, when he meets the lady with the guns for the first time, she is sitting and preparing this. I think it's a letter or something like that, and she's sort of wrapping it all up and putting things aside. And it's not sort of like overdone or like really crazy stuff to show some sort of crazy world. It just shows her like meticulousness in terms of like preparing these things and packing it away. It also gives her, so it's really about her character, but it also grounds her as a person through the tools she is using. So it's a really nice sort of focus on the craft or craft on the details in terms of what makes the characters, but not overdoing it. And if you're comparing that scene with her putting like those tools away to the scene where in Ponyo where the mom is cooking noodles, where she's just sort of like sticking things in pots and pans and sort of making it a little bit more like wildly. It just really shows the character, and you can sort of relate to the feeling of putting these things aside because they just have that right sense of weight and material and all that. I think for me at least that feels pretty unique to Ghibli, that they set aside time in the film to focus on these things because it builds character and it builds the world, and sort of connects everything together, I think, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. And when you're watching these films, it feels so organic and like it's just come out of the film. It doesn't feel like it's something that someone at some point has had to sit down and storyboard or find time and space for. So when you're actually making a piece of work yourself as an animation director, how do you find time to bring that to the characters in the film you're working on?
I think it's tough because it's like speaking about Flea, we didn't have the highest budget, so most of the time when the characters could stand still, then we preferred to do that because then it wasn't like it wouldn't run over the budget. Um, but then again, having things like when Amin's sisters are like listening, or when they're listening to the older sister telling the story about their father, one of the sisters is sort of a bit older than Amin and his older brother. So she's heard the story many times. So we showed that by her sort of sitting a bit more relaxed on her knees, sort of like she's a bit fidgeting with her legs and stuff. She can't sit still because she's like, I've heard this story so many times. So she's a bit more sort of fidgety and moving around, where the others are like just in the story and just like big eyes and looking at the older sister. So we're still trying to find like moments like that to sort of say, okay, this character is like this, and she would probably think of she would be in this headspace during this moment. Yeah, things like that. We're trying to sort of find moments for. But again, I think also for Flea, it was also a matter of like less is more, to not go cartoony on it. Yeah.
And I suppose it's those little moments that are so key to actually getting to the emotional side of the characters as well. It's those little bits that make us see them as rounded humans or rounded monsters in a Ghibli film, whatever they might be. And I suppose that's a side of animation maybe people aren't considering, is just how much those little details are key in building up the entire story, right?
Yeah, but you can tell a lot from how a giant cat monster would unwrap a pack of noodles. Like if it's just like "Rawr," and then eating it, or if it's more like meticulous and nice, then you put it all aside and pick up the little bits and pieces to fill out. Like you can use those moments to really explain a character a lot.
And with something like Flea, where so this is getting into this animated documentary aspect, because I suppose you're working from sound recordings and other materials. So when it comes to character design and then animation on top of that, what is the leeway you're giving yourself to create these characters and give them life as animated characters?
I mean, in terms of character design, then Jess and I were pretty sort of overlapping at that point. So Jess can just jump in here and add things as well. But we had footage of Amin during the interviews when he's on that couch, and we used that as a reference for those scenes. We didn't like trace it or rotoscope it, but we used it to sort of see like how does he wipe away his tears? How do you move when you're just lying down and with your eyes closed and talking about memory? Like you're not gesturing too much and all that stuff. So sort of reference to get a realism from it. But in terms of character design, we of course looked at how he sort of like places himself, or what do you call it, like how his vibe, and sort of try and get something that's similar to that, but still making sure that it's not like oh that's this guy if you see him on the street, he still needs to be anonymous. So I think we were using the reference as a way to sort of get the mood and the vibe from how they sort of presented themselves to stay authentic as much as possible.
Yeah, I think Amin will always feel like the most authentic character in that film because we had more footage and sound recordings of him than by far anyone else. But I guess at some point you kind of have to just say, like, I guess there's all this issue with the representation and how do you like make a person feel real and stay true to who they are in reality. And at some point you just kind of have to say like, we need to make some sort of decision, I guess, and just ask people if it seems accurate. I think it's a lot about also. I mean, we talked a bit about all the small details that make up like how you perceive a character through the screen, and I think that when it comes to like real people, that stuff is equally important. And I think that when you see like sometimes when I like this is hard because I feel like sometimes when you talk about Ghibli, it turns into like a Disney bash. But I feel like a lot of modern animation is like the characters feel kind of both overdeveloped and underdeveloped at the same time because you want them to communicate like a particular thing, like this character is like the sad one or something, and so that becomes like their entire character. So even though you've got this massive team that has like gone really deep into this character and like, oh, how is this, the fact that they're the sad one going to affect every part of their life? It's like, but that's not a real person. Like, sad people can also be happy sometimes, and like, I don't know, maybe that sad person like studied architecture and really liked it at some point or something. Like, I think you just gotta flesh it out a lot more, and then it helps, I think.
But, yeah, I think it's because, Jess, you mentioned Pompoko up top, made me think about that, because that film, even though it's depicting Tanuki, the Tanuki characters have almost 3 different styles they exist in throughout the film, either a very almost photorealistic animal style, or a standing upright style, or ultra cartoony style. And Miyazaki would always have a very coherent, consistent design of his characters, but Takahata always loved to play with that and show us that there's no one way to draw a character. And I suppose with Flea, you've had to find, it's not as simple as having a slider, it's not a Photoshop plugin, but find the right sort of level for character design where it's empathetic, believable, authentic, but also not so realistic that it's too connected to the reality of the story, I suppose.
Yeah, you also want to kind of abstract from it a little bit, I think, to allow people to have emotions about it, and I think that's where films like Grave of the Fireflies and stuff are such great reference, because it's such a good way to like digest hard topics as well, with all the stuff you can do in animation. And yeah, people always ask like, why is it an animated movie? And I understand that question, but I also kind of hate it, because it's a little bit like, well, you're kind of just picking between like a photo and a painting, I guess, and you can say a lot more like biased, I guess, but also you can just have more like mood and there's something that a painting can bring, I think, that it struggles in a photo to do the same.
Yeah, and on that point about anonymity as well that Michael, you're talking about, something that's fascinating about the way that Amin is drawn in Flea is that at no point is the animation used to make him cartoonish at all. It doesn't have that elasticity that people might expect of animation. His face is almost surprisingly unexpressive at points where you'd expect him to be more animated, I guess. Is that a way of kind of letting people into that experience and making them kind of feel more open towards it rather than forcing Amin's emotion on that moment? What was the approach there with his face?
I mean, I think it's a bit going back to what Jess said before, that some of, again, not to bash on Disney because it's just for a different audience, but in those films you want to like show very clearly what people are feeling at that moment. But in Flea, because it's we wanted it to really, like, authentic was one of our keywords. Then it really needs to be a human, and humans are often like multifaceted about how they're feeling about a certain moment. And if I see something sad, I'm not gonna stand on the street and be like, when I look at it, I'm probably just gonna have a blank face and have things happening on internally instead. And to sort of, and that's also like, I'm going a bit in circles, but maybe I think also having like a non-expression, but looking at something and you expect some sort of reaction, then that also forces the audience to really empathize with, and try to like think, I wonder what he's feeling now. He must be, I wonder if he's sad, or maybe he's angry about this thing, or what does he want to get back to his boyfriend, or what is he going to do? Instead of showing directly, he's feeling this now. Then we wanted to let it be more up for interpretation for the audience, to really sit and sort of scan his face to look for clues and look for what is he feeling at this moment. So that was sort of like the thought behind that acting choice of really going as subtle as possible, and trying to really avoid telling the audience like he feels this now, and really force them to try and empathize with him instead. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
there's different ways of doing it as well. Like we chose that route of like, which is a very real person thing to do, I think, like to not be an open book all the time. But I think, when you look at like Ghibli films, there's all that like kind of weird thing they do when the characters are shocked, or when the style kind of goes up and it's almost like a cat hair raised kind of moment. I think even that is like, there's different ways to interpret emotions like that, rather than just being like, like if you want to look sad, you can look sad in like a multitude of different ways. And I think even if you kind of think about how a character would do that, then I think it helps portray them on screen.
Yeah. Going back to Takahata, he seems to be coming up quite a lot in this conversation. Another film where he plays with different styles depending on the scene is Only Yesterday, which is a film which has two time periods, one a sort of nostalgic memory and one the present day. And Flea is another one where it has this nested structure of stories and memory in the present day. And I wondered, both in terms of character design, animation, but then also art direction, how did you tackle that and think about representing those different time periods?
Oh, the time periods, that was a lot of research on that. And I think part of that was like both Kenneth and I come from like a more fiction background, I think. So coming in to a documentary, there was a lot of like, oh, we also want to do right by the people involved and things. So there was a lot of research, I guess. So I think that Jonas, the director, having come from he came from radio documentary before, but has also done some live action films, and he had a good sense of like how realistic he wanted to go. So I think the fact that we knew he wanted to go really realistic with the main style of the animation meant that like, okay, well, now we have to go pretty realistic on like what that's portraying, I guess. And we made some decisions to try and like hide parts of the screen in like darkness and use like really extreme lighting so that we didn't just blow our budget insanely. But I guess like depicting different time periods and different locations was really a lot about what are those time periods and like what characterizes them, also in terms of like how both in terms of like set dressing, but also in terms of how you would shoot that kind of location, I guess. But I mean, that's just kind of the realistic style. Then there was like this also, yeah, as you mentioned, the other kind of graphical style, which was always kind of intended as this very separate thing. So that animation was actually kind of done by a small team that only worked on that. And that was developed tangentially, but still separate from the main body of work, so that it felt like it would also have a different visual cinematography, I guess. So even though like the character design at its base is still the same, it's still you use them in a slightly different way, I guess. And I think a lot of the reason behind that was to make it feel like a more subjective. So if it's one or two artists working on it, then it's like it's their voice, and you're not mixing like 5 different animators trying to make it feel like the same person's voice. It's just a bit easier to do if it's one guy sat by himself. So it was easier to kind of say like this is Amin coming up with something that he either wasn't present for, or it was a really traumatic period in his life, so he doesn't remember it as clearly as he remembers the rest of the story, kind of thing. So that was done with like a very purposeful subjectivity in mind.
I think there was also a way in terms of how we storyboarded the different, those two different, like there's kind of like 3 different styles, you could say. There's like the documentary style where he is filming Amin, that is a bit more handheld, and we have a bit more of a shaky cam, as if he's standing there filming Amin right at that moment. And then there's the clear memories for Amin, where we go back in time. That is more sort of like standard cinema, where we always said like it needs to be filmed as if a camera could be there. So often the camera is sort of like eye level, because the cameraman will be able to stand there and film it, or woman. And then there's also, but it also sort of forces the like cinematography to feel more realistic, because the camera is placed where it could be realistically. You couldn't just have it sort of fly through a little hole and then open up into whatever. But then that was allowed in these more expressive moments. Then the camera can just do whatever and fly around, and things can morph because it becomes more subjective and emotional and stuff.
Yeah, I think the breadth of the style of it, combined with that kind of emotional open book of Amin, and the way that we can read the story how we want it to read. There's a real depth to it. It's not perhaps I'll just join the Disney bashing for a moment. It's not putting the theme on the whiteboard and underlining it 10 times and saying this is the lesson of the story. It's really letting you like interpret the events as you want to, and I think that's that's something that we see in the Ghibli films as well. Like it's not about kind of clearly saying this is what you're meant to learn.
Totally. And I really want to praise another film, like the Kiki's Delivery Service is actually it's probably my favorite one of all the Ghibli films. And I really think that one does that as well, where you follow Kiki and she sort of develops, but it's not like super obvious like what she has learned. It's sort of very internal and very sort of like, I'm like, I can watch it many times and still feel like, oh, I'm getting like learning new sides of her, and how the cat is suddenly less and less expressive, and how she has to stand on her own feet, and nothing is sort of like overexpressed, even though it is a fairly cartoony film and sort of for kids in a way. I feel like it's really, really well balanced in terms of how much you're showing of her emotional journey, and how much you are left to interpret of like how it is to grow up and become mature. So that was at least a inspiration for me in how I wanted to direct a bit the acting and stuff.
Jess, just come back to something you just said, which resounded with something that we've talked about very recently on the podcast, about animators' hands, being, if you have a smaller team, you can really see an animator's subjectivity through a scene. We talked about Mamoru Hosoda on the podcast very recently, and he at one point reduced his team to the bare bones because he wanted his animators to be actors, is the way he described it. And Jake and I don't have an artistic bone in our bodies, although Jake is a better sketcher than I am. He can do a very good Totoro if you ever need to ask him for one. I can't. And we can't see it, but we hear animators talking about, oh, that's so clearly animated by this hand, by that hand. You can see the sort of bravura statements of certain animators when they're working on a sequence. And I wonder, could you expand on that a little bit, and what you mean by that, and Kenneth as well? This idea of animators as actors, any comment on that?
I mean, I guess you like, everyone has their strengths in terms of, like you have some people coming in because they're like, have always loved action sequences, and then they're really good at like that sort of thing. And I mean, that's like a very practical strength, I guess. But I mean, you can see it down to like the way, because of course we have all these guides of like, this is how you draw a character, this is how you draw a background. But you can kind of see people's personalities in the way things are drawn, I guess. Like I think there was one project at some point where I was like, oh my god, this person only draws like circles like they're drawn in like the Hercules Disney film, and it turned out they just loved that film when they were a kid, so when they grew up like as teenagers they just drew Hercules a lot. So I think you have like little kind of personal quirks in that way that kind of sneak in despite you trying to like beat it out of people to a certain extent. But I mean, everyone, I guess, also has this vision of like, if you're given a scene, you have so many hours to work on it and stuff, and you develop your own internal idea of what it should look like, even though you've been given this brief of like, this is what we want it to look like. You don't have the finished thing in front of you, so you're still kind of interpreting a character in a moment, and especially with like listening to a voice and working out what's the emotions behind that at this point in time, and that's always a very subjective thing. So you can see if someone's like a romantic at heart and this kind of stuff just from the way people interpret briefs, I think.
So what's your quirk, Kenneth, that we can look out for? If there is one.
Better stay in my model probably, so it's very fluid and organic is how I hide that.
But I don't know, I mean, you work more with animators than I do on like a day-to-day. I think it's more obvious with animators than it is with like background artists, right? I don't know if you have any anecdotes.
Yes, I mean, you can definitely see it in how they're even like drawing the characters, that they are like just different ways of how they're drawing the details. It comes across in their personal styles. And then there's also ways that they depict movement. I remember in animation school when we had to do like animate like walks and learn how to draw walks. You could guess who animated it by how they walk, because you could see like, oh, that's totally how this and that person walks, and then now the Pink Panther is walking like Mikkel or like another person. So you can just see how like your own sort of natural sense and understanding of movement and acting and stuff comes across in how you depict it. And that is something we're trying to sort of cast animators And even when we get animators in and we work with them, you sort of notice that, oh, this animator is really good at this thing, or this animator is really good at that subtle, like little thing that we want to use in this scene. So in Flea, there was an animator who came from much more about like a Disney school, and he was really good at adding that little bit too much of like an overacting in a way, so it felt like sometimes it could sort of steer into like it felt like you're sort of forcing emotions out of you when you're combining it with the Flea style. But he was perfect with these sort of like telenovela scenes in Flea, where people sort of like over dramatic. So we gave him all those scenes, and they just worked out perfectly with his style, because everything was just a bit too dramatic and a bit too sort of had too much flair, like intentionally. Like so like that's for example, an example of how you would cast animators depending on what skills they have naturally.
And like an understanding. I think like there was one moment I think where there's like the two sisters on the bed and they're like reading a magazine or something, and I remember way back then there's something they did, and I just remember looking at them and being like, oh, these like they're just like two teenage girls, they would never act like this or something. And then we ended up talking about like, oh, okay, but then the other sister's gonna like push it so that she was reading the page that before, so she wants to go back to that page, but her sister wants to turn the page and that sort of thing. So I think you can also see people's background as like, if you have a 45-year-old man animating teenage girls, it's not going to be the same if you have a teenage girl doing it.
Yeah.
So it's always good to have like multiple like review sessions with different people to say a teenage girl would never do that.
And how are those sessions? There's one Ghibli session. I think it's actually after the film's been finished. It's in the From Up on Poppy Hill DVD extra, where Hayao Miyazaki goes out the front and then schools them all on the timing of walking. It must be quite brutal sometimes, some of those sessions.
It can definitely be. I remember like animation school being quite brutal, because you're trying so hard, and then you're just getting bashed sometimes because like, oh, you don't know, like the weight is wrong, and like, oh, you poor little thing, let me show you. But I mean, on Flea it was luckily not that harsh, and we usually had like the director and then me in a separate room to sort of go, oh, what are we going to do? To sort of look at it and see what it needs, and then you would forward that to the animator. But I think on higher budget shows or films, I do see that you bring every animator into a big room and just like commonly review, and I think that must be so tough if you're not the most confident person. I would hate it.
Especially with these massive budget films, because you spend like weeks on, like, I think, what was it, the average, I can't remember when this fact is from, but I remember hearing at some point that Pixar's average was like 6 seconds a week per animator, which sounds fairly realistic, and like our quotas on Flea, I can't remember exactly what they were, kind of, it was drastically different, I remember.
Yeah, it was like 15 seconds, something like that, if it's not more even.
Yeah, so I think you like, if you've worked for weeks on this one scene and then it just gets absolutely destroyed in front of people, then of course it can be like really draining. But I mean, like I said earlier, you have I think a lot of people who go into animation, it's a passion thing to do, right? So I think people can also put a lot of weight on their craft as like an expression of themselves. So if you review them really harshly, even if you're coming from a place of like, this is not about you and the work, this is about like what is necessarily for the film, like in another setting, like as we said, like the Disney thing is just a totally different audience, like that's going to be a different requirement than what is needed on like a Ghibli film or on Flea or any other type of film. But it can really like, you can see it in their face. They're just like, oh. Yeah.
Well, Kenneth, am I right in thinking you did a bit of work with Cartoon Saloon as well? So for Song of the Sea, and so like I suppose in the grand international scheme of hand-drawn animation houses, they're a pretty big deal now. How would the Cartoon Saloon environment compare to the Sun Creature and Flea environment compared to what you see of the Pixar and Disney's out there?
I mean, when I worked on Song of the Sea, I wasn't there. I was in Viborg in with the early days of Sun Creature Studio, when we were just like 3 people, and then I was just doing a bit of cleanup on it. So that one I can't really say how it was to be in a production in terms of their studio. But later I went over to their studio to do a storyboard for Eddie of the Realms, a pilot they did. But like, in terms of like the like differences, yeah, that's a good question. I think they have a like very similar vibe in a way, in that they are like a fairly small still. So they still have you still feel pretty close to everyone there, and feel like you can go up to anyone and talk to them. There's that sort of like master who walks in from the door into the room, and then everyone's like, "Ooh," and hide behind the desks or something like that. And that just creates a pretty safe environment where you feel like you can contribute with ideas and pitch suggestions without feeling like you're risking being fired. And I hope that's the same feeling as Sun Creature.
What's the game plan with Sun Creature? I mean, going on the site and seeing the portfolio, the sort of contract work with really high quality stuff. But do you have aspirations for features and everything in the future? What's to come?
So we're definitely aiming towards being able to start creating our own content as well. That is a goal for the studio, and to have internal artists like our full-time employees, such as like Jess as well, to be able to, if she wants, to pitch a project, and then we could potentially pick that up and develop a pitch or a teaser or a pilot or something like that, depending on what the project is. So that is definitely a goal for us and a vision, because most of us got into it with the idea of creating either art or stories, and we really want to sort of foster that and still encourage that, so it doesn't just become service work. And I think animation is this sort of weird mix of, you go into it with some sort of passion, but then it's a lot of hard work, and it becomes this weird mix of passion versus factory work sometimes even. And you need to be very like disciplined and work in a certain way. Folder structure and formats and Excel sheets and all that stuff becomes part of the daily life as well, even when you just want to draw.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes an advertisement comes along that means you can actually put a bit of your love of Ghibli maybe into the advert as well, right? So tell us about the advert for Oregon and the what little Easter eggs might people find in there?
I mean, I think the whole film is just one big Easter egg for Ghibli. It's probably fair to say. I mean, it was very much from the client as well, saying that they wanted that Ghibli feel, that they wanted that to really to feel like a Ghibli film when you watch it, to sort of Ghiblify Oregon. But that was just like a gift for us as a studio, because we love that style as well. And to really like dive into it and say like, okay, what does actually make his style? I remember looking at like how you shade the character, or how they do the shadows on the characters, which is mostly these like very rounded shapes. So everything feels very like soft, and like clothes are like, there's very rarely like a hard edge on outfits and stuff. Everything feels pretty rounded. But only to a certain level, because it doesn't become cartoony either. So there's like very like specific details looking into that, which is just a gift for animation nerds like us to be paid to sit and look into like one frame. And I remember our art director Simon Lee at that point also really studying the backgrounds and looking at painting processes from Ghibli, seeing how you would use these like poster paints to paint the backgrounds on these giant canvases where everyone's drooling watching it. So it was amazing to sit and just try and copy that style, and then of course it's very humbling as well, because then when you see it, you're like, we're all kind of there, but like you can never become like that master.
Well, I mean, at the current rate, like they're rumored to be making 2 minutes worth of film every month on the new Miyazaki film. So, I mean, send them this and say, guys, if you need some extra help, like we send us an email. Here's our job application. All right. So, I mean, there's so much more we could talk about with Flea and Ghibli, but we've reached the point of the conversation where we need to know where we need to travel to next, because we've spoken about Ghibli on this podcast. We've spoken about, well, we just mentioned Cartoon Saloon, and we are always looking for other people that we should be studying. So where do you guys think the Ghibliotheque should be migrating to next? Jess?
Oh, on the spot. I was, when you mentioned that at the beginning, I was like, I'm going to think about this, and then promptly forgot about it. But no, I mean, I think this is terrible to admit, but I don't watch that much animation anymore. And I know a lot of animators who say the same thing, and I think it's because out of like a way to not be self-referential with some of the stuff, because there's not that much animation that comes out every year, I guess, at the end of the day. And I mean, the stuff that I do watch, I'm always like, this is amazing. But I think a lot of my influences come from like live action.
Feel free to suggest live action. We've had live action suggestions in the past. So,
well, I mean, one of the curators of the Miyazaki exhibition said do Celine Sciamma. So
it's like cool. I mean, I think like when I graduated, like at the school over here in Denmark, Kenneth and I went to the same uni. That's kind of how we originally met, very vaguely. When I did my graduation film with some friends, one of our that was a film that was based on the tsunami in Japan in 2011. So a lot of the references were coming from Japanese life, and so we looked of course at Ghibli a lot. But I remember that we looked a lot at Yasujiro Ozu, who may have been mentioned before. I don't know, but I think that that's a really good reference for I think there's a lot of the same spirit in those films as there is in Ghibli films, and a lot of these little mood moments and small details that make a character. I think it's something that relates pretty closely. I'll look at that.
He's got long filmography.
Yeah, I mean, I really like late autumn. I think it's late spring that everyone says. Yeah, it's either that or it's the other way around. I can't remember. There's one that's really famous and it's the other one.
What about you, Kenneth?
I think for animation, I would say Masaki Yuasa. I don't know if he has been recommended before, but I love his stuff. I want to birth his children, as they say. I mean, I watched Tatami Galaxy, I think it's called, the series, which is just amazing. So I can highly recommend that, and Ping Pong from him. But just anything he does, basically, just watch it, and you'll be in for a treat.
He's a classic example of an animator who couldn't stick to model, so they bumped him over to storyboards instead of an in-betweener quite early on. His stuff is so fluid and wonderful.
Yes, and it just goes so many crazy places, but it still sticks within the sort of the experience of the story and the experience of the world. But it's just absolute creativity and just goes wild, and I love it. And I think Tatami Galaxy and Ping Pong are two examples where that sort of craziness and wildness still stays within a pretty sort of cohesive story, or a narrative you can actually follow without it getting too abstract. Although I love Mind Game and these other movies where it goes completely crazy, then I can really recommend those two series as well. He also did one, has a weird name. It's Hands Off Isaacin, I think it's called, which actually I watched it, and it's actually really explains the animation process really, really well. There's even a show where an episode where they run out of budget. And then they are how do we save time? And then they go through different tricks in animation of having just one drawing that you're sort of moving the camera around to make it look more dramatic. So that one I can highly recommend. And then live action, I would say Lynn Ramsey. She's really, really cool. I love her as well. I would love to work with her one day, but it's probably not going to happen.
I mean, she just made a documentary. Who knows what she might do next? She wants to do an animated one. She knows who to call.
I will be ready. I will work for free for her.
Don't say that.
Can you cut that out? Oh.
Yeah, won't look good on the spreadsheet.
If you record yourself saying, my normal rate, and we'll paste that in. Amazing recommendations. Thank you so much. Oh, it's been such a treat speaking with both of you, Jess and Kenneth. Thank you for joining us and talking Flea and Ghibli. It's been a treat. Thank you to Kenneth and Jess for speaking with us and tackling all our ignorant, nerdy questions, not having an artistic bone in our bodies. That was such a treat. Thank you so much. And please go and watch Flea if you haven't already.
Absolutely. And we've still got a lot more to come on the Chatbus. So many more conversations to get a bit too nerdy about Studio Ghibli. Next time we are talking to the co-writer of what is already one of the best films of the year, Michael.
Oh, I definitely say so. And also one of the biggest Studio Ghibli and anime tributes of the year. It's Pixar's Turning Red that premiered on Disney Plus earlier this year. An instant favourite for our team, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And so we're very, very lucky to have Julia Cho, who wrote it alongside Domi Shi, coming on the podcast to get into her Ghibli roots. Someone with an incredibly unique trajectory for getting into Studio Ghibli, and I'd love it if there's anyone else that has somehow mimicked that as well. So a bit of a tease for you there. And if you haven't heard it already, we actually had Domi Shi on the podcast way back in the early days of the pandemic. She was kind enough to Zoom us where she was remotely directing a film, which sounds like an absolute nightmare, but she was willing to give us an hour or so to chat about her Ghibli origin story too, which was lovely. So definitely check back in our feed and listen to that episode.
But that's next episode. For now, that's it from us. Before we go, please do sign up to our Patreon if you haven't already. We've got all sorts of fun stuff happening in the Discord already, as well as the Library Cafe episodes that's going live. We had our take at length on the Batman. We also had an episode very recently about Turning Red, which of course is the film we're going to be talking about in the next episode. Until then, you can also catch us on socials too. We're at Ghibliotech on Twitter, ghibliotech.pod. On Instagram, you can follow Steph at _Steph Watts and Jake at Jake H. Cunningham.
And you can follow Michael at Michael J. Leader.
Ghibliotech is produced by Michael Leader, Jake Cunningham, Harold McShill and Steph Watts. Our music is by Anthony Ing.